There are two views against the possibility of strong AI. The first is centered around John Searle's well-known 1980 skeptical thought experiment, the Chinese room. However, there is a second, largely unknown view that preceded Searle's. This second view is in Anatoly Dneprov's 1961 short story, The Game. Both ask, can computers think? Both answer, no. Although Searle's experiment received a lot of criticism, The Game did not receive any response. However, Dneprov's argument is developed to a level comparable to Searle's. I argue that the radical difference between the two is the perception of the brain. Searle believes that machines can think, but the human brain is the only machine capable of thinking, while Dneprov would not agree. For him, the brain is part of an organism, and an organism cannot be regarded as a machine. Therefore, Dneprov's work can be helpful to challenge conceptions of the brain as a machine in the current debates on AI. So here we see the cover of the journal where the short story was published. And here is the illustration to the short story. In The Game, Dneprov describes a game where 1,500 willing students are divided into groups that are intended to communicate, interact, and process information in the same way as a mainframe computer. In the story, the students are attending a big mathematics conference, and the game, which takes place at a stadium, is the final event of the conference. The students are divided into small groups, and the story is narrated from the first-person perspective of one of the participating students. Unbeknown to them, each group represents a component of a mainframe computer. The first group functions as the memory unit, the second as the input unit, and the third as the output unit, the fourth as the central processing unit, and so on. The whole structure of the mainframe computer is mirrored and recreated through the interactions between the students. Some groups transmit binary numbers to each other, and other groups manipulate the binary numbers. However, there are students who find the process boring, and at least one student leaves the game before the end. The next day, Professor Zarubin, the main organizer of the conference, tells the students the results. At first, Zarubin asks the students, who speaks Portuguese? No one can. Zarubin then reveals that the real purpose of the game was to show that computers can't think. In the game, the students were interacting as components of a digital machine running a program to translate a sentence from Portuguese to Russian. Because somebody left earlier, the last word of the translation was corrupted and the result was imperfect. The Portuguese sentence was translated as the greatest goals are achieved through minor but continuous and then a broken word, something like EKTDT, where EKTDT should be translated as efforts. In this story, the students weren't aware of what they were doing. In a similar way, Dneprov concludes, the computers cannot be aware of what they are doing. However, one of the students, Anton Golovin, tries to argue. Of course, we were unaware of what we are doing. Nobody believes that neurons can understand what the brain is thinking. The same holds true for computer chips. Only the computer as a whole could be capable of thinking. Zarubin refused the student. If so, some entity should have been created at the stadium during the game, some sort of Hegel's Weltgeist. The line of thought in Searle's Chinese room is similar, but later interpretations reveal a striking difference between Searle and Dneprov. In Searle's experiment, somebody is locked in a room in China without any knowledge of Chinese. He receives a text in Chinese from the outside, and strictly following a set of instructions in her native language creates a fluent response in Chinese. In fact, acting in this way, the person in Chinese room passes Turing's test and creates the impression of being fluent in Chinese, which, according to Turing, is sufficient proof of intelligence. For Searle, computers work in the same way as this Chinese room, and this formal combination of symbols without awareness is similar to the view expressed by Dneprov in The Game. In the same way as Dneprov's students have no awareness that they are translating Portuguese, and as Searle's man in the Chinese room has no awareness of what he is communicating in Chinese, computers have no awareness of what they are processing. One of the main advantages of the Chinese room over the game is that Searle tries to answer a set of objections to this thought experiment, the most common of which he now believes to be the system reply. The system reply suggests that although the man in the Chinese room is not aware of what is going on, the system as a whole has this capability. Searle responds by internalizing the room. Let us suppose that all the books in the Chinese room and all the rules have been learned by heart by somebody. In this situation, to suppose that there is any strong AI consciousness is to suppose that some subpersonality capable of Chinese. However, this is fine with some of Searle's opponents. It is striking that the system reply is presented in Dneprov's short story. The big fan of cybernetics, the student Golovin, presented the same objection. Dneprov's form of the thought experiment is even stronger than Searle's in this regard because there is nothing material in Dneprov's computer. Searle's answer to the system reply could be more convincing if instead of internalization, he has chosen externalization. The best way out of the system reply is the way out of the Chinese room. The only entity a system reply can detect in Dneprov is some sort of a ghost of the stadium, which is much less plausible empirically when compared to the unconscious subpersonality of the man with internalized Chinese room. The major divergence between Searle and Dneprov stems from the fact that Searle, while stressing the biological nature of the mind, believes the brain to be a machine. Thus, he stressed that no one would suppose that we could produce milk and sugar by running a computer simulation of the formal sequences in lactation and photosynthesis. But where the mind is concerned, many people are willing to believe in such a miracle. Moreover, according to Searle, mental states are as real as any other biological phenomena, for example, like lactation, photosynthesis, and digestion. But when answering, can a machine think, he replied explicitly that only a machine could think, and only a very special kind of machine, namely brains and machines with internal causal powers equivalent to those of brains. In fact, Searle's notion of the machine is broader than a commonsensical idea of it. It is hard to see these two positions, the brain as a machine and thinking as a biological process, as consistent. Are cows milk-producing machines and are plants merely photosynthesizing machines? It's obvious that from the viewpoint of bioethics, there is a difference between a machine synthesizing milk and a cow. Cows reproduce, regenerate, and everyone is unique. It's simply impossible to turn a cow off. This is clear even without mentioning the grim ethical consequences of conflating living organisms and machines. This line of thought is a natural corollary to the criticism of animal exploitation as formulated by Leo Tolstoy or Ruth Harrison. The fact that some mechanisms can be detected in biological organisms does not mean that there are any machines there except for possible artificial augmentation. It constitutes a shortcoming in Searle's approach which seems to be overlooked by all his opponents. Searle mechanized the notion of the brain for it to be comparable to the notion of the computing machine. Already Turing did it by approaching man as a machine in 1948. At the same time, Searle wants this brain machine to have organicist functions, like human self-determination and intentionality. However, for such human features as self-determination and intentionality to really work in our argument against strong AI, they should be defined as they are, as our embodied features. Human intelligence comes from the unity and uniqueness of a human being, its biological, cultural, and social evolution. Computer's intelligence is, on the contrary, just a machine ready to be copied, disassembled, turned off, or upgraded. Turing suggested an overly mechanistic view of the brain close to Searle's when he introduced a notion of unorganized machine, a machine with random connections between its elements, which Turing views as a model of a nervous system in 1948. Searle seems to be willing to accept such a view when he wrote that perhaps other physical and chemical processes could produce exactly these effects. Perhaps, for example, Martians also have intentionality, but their brains are made of different stuff. This is an empirical question. However, it is an empirical question only when speculating about extraterrestrial life, but it is not an empirical question with regard to machines. By not acknowledging this explicitly, Searle gives his opponents more than he should. And again, the reason is an overly mechanistic view on the brain, which distinguishes Searle from Dneprov. For instance, we can consider a case of evolutionary programming as one of counter-argument and counter-methods. Neither Searle nor Dneprov considered evolutionary programming as a way to create a strong AI. However, in case where the brain is duplicated sufficiently in the evolutionary process, Searle seems to accept the possibility of creating a strong AI through evolutionary programming or through a German way, relying on indeterminacy and selection. Dneprov seems to reject this idea for the reasons presented below. Dneprov actually has another short story that can further illuminate the organism mechanism aspect of the strong AI problem in his view. In the science fiction short story Islands of Crabs from 1958, Dneprov introduced a case of artificial evolution. So those are illustrations. In Crabs, Dneprov depicts a scientific engineering experiment where the mechanisms, mechanical crabs, are created to reproduce with slight random variations and compete for the metal on an island somewhere in the tropical zone of the ocean. The competition meant to be violent, so that in the end, the fastest and the most invulnerable subspecies of the crab-like metal collector will win. The project pursues a broadly military goal to create a means to collect all metal in the enemy territory, and it will be particularly handy if the crabs will also collect the metal which constitutes the tanks and cannons of the enemy. The instance of this artificial selection ends in an utter failure. Crabs killed the main engineer for his mental dental prosthesis and destroys all means of existence of his employee, the narrator of Crabs, like in the third illustration. Moreover, instead of developing the speed and effectivity, the crabs start to grow in size. In the end, the narrator is rescued unconscious by the expedition's ship, which arrived to pick up the results of the experiment. He was lying between the giant claws of the last mechanical crab. The crab was dead or dead-like because all the island's metal was collected. This idea of an artificial evolution fated to fail proliferated in Russian science fiction after Dneprov's story and even influences writers in neighboring countries. So there are some translations and the novel which was influenced, I think. So Polish writer Stanisław Lem, more famous because of Tarkowski's movie based on his novel Solaris, made his version of Dneprov's story in a novel Peace on Earth from 1984, where the artificial evolution made a turn opposite to one in crabs. The mechanisms meant to evolve in better and better weapons on the moon disappeared. The astronauts who returned to collect the results of the experiment of artificial evolution are shocked by this fact, but in the end, the truth is revealed. Machines were evolving in more and more miniature models. As a result, the struggle shifted to the nano level, and the fighting mechanisms tuned into the dust covering the moon. The nano machines managed to return to Earth while with the moon expedition and destroy all mechanic potential of humanity, reducing human civilization to the pre-modern level. Besides the simple moral of the story by Dneprov and the stories written under Dneprov's influence, where the creation turns against the creator and Mary Shelley's fashion, there is one idea important to the debates regarding strong AI. The analogy between artificial and natural selection should not be overemphasized. They are two different processes, and there is no reason to expect the same results. So we are reaching the conclusion now. The comparison of Dneprov and Searle's thought experiments gives a new counter-argument to the system response to the Chinese rule. The best way out of the system response is the way out of the Chinese rule, the way given in the backbone of Dneprov's thought experiment, as a story about an outdoor activity. It is better than the way of the internalization of the Chinese rule chosen by Searle, because the objection of the subpersonality capable of Chinese in the man with such an internalized Chinese rule will be impossible in the externalized variant. Dneprov's thought experiment proceeds outdoors at the stadium, and only personality the system responder could detect is something as unlikely as a ghost of the stadium. On a deeper level, the comparison shows that the unity of intentionality and of self-determination in itself and with each other, Searle warns, originates from the organic nature of human beings. Searle perfectly understands it, but he does not follow a necessary corollary. Not only are we as a whole unlike machines, all our parts are unlike machines, and our evolution is not of a mechanical type. Our brains are not computers, but organs inside of living beings. They are unique, can regenerate and grow with the organism and reproduce with the organism as a whole, unlike any machine. So that any parallel between the human mind and a computer's computational abilities are flawed on both theoretical and ethical levels. At the same time, Searle goes too far when he equals information processing in computer with process in stomachs, thermostats, rainstorms, and hurricanes. He does it as an irony regarding the rules of the discussion he participates in and greatly contributes to. But Searle could do more if, instead, he undermines some of the rules and follows a strict machine-organism distinction, which is shown by the comparison of his own thought experiment and Dneprov's thought experiment, where the latter does have such a distinction in a strong form. Someone with a strong notion of the machine-organism distinction could make a better attack on strong AI by targeting the brain-computer analogy as a sort of a conflation between a machine and a living organ. In this way, it is also possible to avoid the ethical dangers of the conflating of organisms with machines, because from the fundamental bioethical view as given by Leo Tolstoy and Rolf Harrison, the former should not be regarded as the latter. Thank you very much for attention.